Welcome to the stage, Director of the Bridgetown Initiative for the Office of the Prime Minister of Barbados, Pepukaye Bardouille.
Hi, good afternoon. The stage lights are still bright. Thank you so much to friends who were here earlier today, and there may be more people trickling in, so much appreciate you taking the time. I have the pleasure today of interviewing two really fascinating people, and I mean that sincerely. We've been having fun in the green room. We had fun in the prep session, and so I think this is going to be a bit more of a free flow than the wonderful producers were expecting with this piece of paper. But let me take a minute to introduce them. But perhaps I'll introduce myself first. So as the voice of God has already said, I'm Pep Bardouille with the Bridgetown Initiative. I have the pleasure of working for Prime Minister and the Honourable Mia Motley of Barbados, a true inspiration on a number of global and national agendas related to resilience. So the two remarkable individuals who I'm going to be joined by on the panel are Jennifer Morris, who's the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's leading conservation organizations, and I'm sure many of you know it very well. Jennifer has dedicated over 2 decades of her career to environmental conservation and sustainable development. Under her leadership, the Nature Conservancy has launched groundbreaking initiatives to protect natural habitats, address the climate crisis, and promote sustainability across the globe. Her visionary approach has not only advanced conservation efforts, but also inspired countless individuals to take action for our planet, for which we are grateful. And joining her is Iván Duque, the former President of Colombia, whose tenure was marked by deep commitment to environmental protection and sustainable development within Colombia and well beyond it. Under President Duque's leadership, Colombia expanded its protected areas, which isn't something we should take for granted because we're not seeing that in every country around the world. It also took significant strides in combating deforestation in the Amazon and has played a pivotal role in international environmental agreements. His innovative policies have left a lasting legacy, contributing to the global fight against the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. So today, Jennifer Morris and President Duque will share insights from their vast experiences, explore the critical intersection of conservation and leadership, and talk about the links between climate and development more broadly. I would like to invite them to the stage. Good afternoon.
Hello.
How are you doing, Pep?
I'm doing as well as I was about 3 minutes ago in the green room. How are you? This is a small audience, so I think we have an opportunity to be, really clear and intimate in our discussions, and I hope that we'll take advantage of that and have some fun along the way. Could I start with you, Jennifer? Tell us in a few minutes, with whatever passion you want to bring to the stage, what your vision is for the Nature Conservancy and also what you feel is really critical at this particular juncture in the natural environment and climate change area.
Great. So hi, everyone. So great to be with you. This is my second summit event, and you guys are just incredible group of people. I only wish that I could spend more time, go down to the Caribbean with you all, but hopefully we'll have a blast in the time that we have together. So I have been the CEO of the Nature Conservancy just under 4 years, and before that I had a career at another wonderful organization called Conservation International. And both those organizations really, and many of the environmental organizations out there, share a common goal, and that is, of course, we need to address 2 main crises facing planet Earth. One, the biodiversity crisis or the nature crisis. So when we say biodiversity, we're basically just talking about the diversity of species on planet Earth, but really nature. And we know that we've lost about 70% of our species in our lifetime. And it's increasing every day. In fact, we're losing species that before we even know that they exist. This is a huge crisis for the planet, not just because it's incredible nature, but also because of all the things that nature provides for us in terms of watershed protection, pollinators, all the things that you all, when you go out into our incredible planet and see things around the world that you want to see. The second thing is, of course, the climate crisis. And my organization addresses both of those. We are the world's largest environmental organization. We're in every single US state, and we're in over 70 countries around the world. And our mission is to try to really not just to understand and raise awareness about those issues, but really to help solve those problems. And that's why I love Summit, because you're bringing together just incredible different people to think about how do we use art and science and technology to really drive some of those changes. I want to talk a little bit about the role of nature, and I know that President Duque is very passionate about this, has been a world leader in this in his country of Colombia as well as globally. So nature is often forgotten when we think about climate. It's not only forgotten by all of us here. When we think about climate change, we think about, of course, what comes out of our tailpipe and how we produce goods. But the reality is nature and nature protection can solve 30% of the climate crisis. But yet right now, it gets less than 7% of global financing. One, because we haven't figured out great ways to monetize it. There's been, some attempts at the carbon market. There's about $2 billion, just over $2 billion in total trades annually in the carbon market. It's still really small. There's been some interesting things that, we will talk about later around debt for nature swaps, et cetera, but they have not yet scaled to the level that we need them to be to address the nature crisis and the nature component of the climate crisis. So what we try to do is really develop innovative financial solutions to solve another crisis that I want to raise, and that is the debt crisis. The debt crisis is, we were just talking about this in the green room, it's something that maybe you don't hear about on the news, but if you come from a place in a developing country, you know this very, very well. Right now, over 60% of developing countries are either at risk or default, or very soon to be at risk of default on their sovereign debt. So the money that they're borrowing from governments, from individuals, bonds that they have raised to build ports, to develop their infrastructure in their countries. It is absolutely unsustainable right now because we're asking countries in the midst of climate change, a crisis that they have actually not really done themselves, much of the crisis, of course, being caused by developed nations, they are now having to make choices. Do I pay my military? Do I pay my teachers? Or do I pay my creditors? And that's the reality. So these countries on the front lines of climate change and biodiversity loss are not able to have enough resources to fund that resiliency, building up their coastal ecosystems, improving the livelihoods of farmers, because they're having to pay back their creditors. Now, I want to hear a lot about what's happening with the Bridgetown Initiative, but I'm just going to mention some solutions. So that's the problem. Debt crisis, with climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis all intertwined. Now, what are some solutions? So at the Nature Conservancy, we helped pioneer a whole new effort called Nature Bonds, and that started in a country called the Seychelles in 2015. And the idea was quite simple. How do we help the government of the Seychelles refinance their debt? And actually, the savings from that refinancing can go into environmental conservation. It was a small transaction at the time, it was pioneering, and we've since then have now done an additional 4 more of these transactions, the Nature Conservancy, including in Barbados, in Belize, and in Gabon, is the most recent one in the country of Gabon. And these efforts have helped to refinance $1.2 billion in sovereign debt, which has unlocked $400 million in money for conservation from the private sector, 100% for the private sector. And we do that, if you imagine refinancing your mortgage, we brought in a really rich uncle, and that was the US government. The US government underwrites the risk for the new bondholders. So you're able to change the terms of the debt, reduce the debt burden for the country, and then put that money into conservation. This is a win-win, and it's scaling. And it's not just us doing this. Pew Charitable Trust, another big NGO, is doing this, as well as many other NGOs are getting into this game. So it's this really important solution. But we have so much more to do, and I'm just really excited to be here to share some of these ideas. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I think there's a number of points that you mentioned that I'd love to jump in on. But first, over to you, President Duque. So what has driven your leadership in the biodiversity and nature space under your presidency? What is it that sparked that for you? And what are you most proud of in terms of your achievements, specifically in Colombia, but also beyond?
Well, thank you so much, Pep. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all. It's a real honor for me to be in my first meeting at the summit. So you asked me about what do we feel proud of what we achieved. And I'll say there were 4 things that I consider reshaped the way we approach climate and nature in Colombia. As you know, we live now in times of very heavy polarizing politics all around the planet. And you might think that in our country is not the exception. So when we went to debate in Congress a roadmap in order to tackle climate, we were able to pass unanimously in both chambers the climate action bill in Colombia. Something that I never imagined it was going to occur, and it was going to occur quite fast. And when people ask me, why did that happen? I would say because we didn't have deniers of the climate crisis we face. And I think that was a very important political achievement, because we were able to set the ground of what do we have to do that takes us to the next step. And that's the second thing that we feel proud of. And it was to tell the Colombian people that in order for us to do something meaningful, we had to expand the protected areas. By the time we started the administration, we only had 13% of the country declared as a protected area, and we were able to take this to more than 30% in 3 years, including the years of the pandemic. So we saw that as a possibility to unify a consensus with the scientific community, because we did it with science. So that was a major step. And we also started with maritime protected areas. And we passed from 14% to 38% of maritime protected areas. And we made a very important argument. And people don't know that on an annual basis, the amount of carbon that is released by trawling practices, trawling fishery practices, is almost the same as all the air and space emissions annually. So we said, if we protect the coral reefs, if we protect the species, and we give this possibility of doing before 2030, and in fact we achieved it in 2022, that also put Colombia as a leader in terms of conservation. The third element is related to the energy transition. So we had a very clean energy matrix, but it was all relied primarily on hydro. 75% of our electricity came from hydro. But we only had 0.2% of our energy matrix in non-conventional renewables. And we said, okay, let's try to bring the players, the investors, let's give the right incentives. And we designed an auction mechanism to bring participants. Our first auction was a disaster. Not a single kilowatt was being able to be sold. And it was kind of sad. I remember the minister wanted to resign, and I said, no, let's take the lesson and let's try to figure out what's pending. And then we decided a two edges auction where we had the buyers and the sellers, and we were able to pass from 0.2% of the energy matrix in non-conventional and renewable to almost 14%. So we literally multiplied for more than 100 times what we had installed. And that was another major achievement. And last but not least has to do with the essence of biodiversity. Because I come from a country that is a superpower, but it's a superpower of biodiversity. So if Colombia had equivalent in oil, what it has in biodiversity, we will be the Saudi Arabia or the United States in terms of production. But we had that biodiversity, and we identified that that is something that defines us, and we started creating mechanisms in order, as Jennifer well said, to monetize in a positive way to enhance protection. So we came to the New York Stock Exchange, and we were the first country in the Western Hemisphere to present a green taxonomy, where the markets knew step by step, issue by issue, what we were undertaking in Colombia. And we launched 2 global green bonds, 2 local green bonds, and the market said, we trust, we see what you're doing, and they gave us a 7% greenium, or premium in that case, that allowed us not only to make a very strong case for finance, but also connected to biodiversity. And I'll finish by saying this. People don't necessarily know that the Amazon is an essential and critical element to achieve all the goals for 2030. We can do everything well in the Western Hemisphere in terms of climate action, but if we don't get the Amazon right, we're not going to meet the targets. So putting together a plan with 8 countries to protect biodiversity called the Leticia Pact allowed for the first time to have a detailed coordination so that we could tackle deforestation, reduce deforestation rates, and try to empower indigenous communities to create market-driven, nature-based solutions. So those are the things that we feel proud that we're able to achieve. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think it's important to pause on those points for a minute because these are not insignificant. And you mentioned that Colombia is not a superpower, perhaps not in size, but in terms of leadership. And I'm really going to free flow a little bit here. As I said, we're going to go off script because initially this was supposed to be a moderated session. And it feels a little bit more like a collaboration of people who are equally passionate about this global challenge. We come at it from different perspectives. But I don't think one should for a minute underestimate how complex an agenda it is that you've brought to the table. And you talk about there not having been deniers, which is amazing, but it doesn't mean that the path wasn't necessarily uphill, right? I guess there's always internal politics in a country that one has to navigate. And so often when we talk about these success stories, we assume that it was smooth sailing, no pun intended, all the way. But the reality is that there are lots and lots of challenges, both internationally and domestically. And there are a number of points that you brought up, both Jennifer and President Duque, that I'd like to kind of riff off. And maybe we can use this as a discussion. I don't want to monopolize this to talk about Bridgetown, but the reality is that these are all interconnected. So there's 4 elements of what you've shared that I think are relevant. The first is debt swaps. And I'm going to weave that into a little bit of a perspective from Barbados. The second is clearly from your failed but then successful auctions, the role of the private sector and what it actually takes to catalyze them and get their interest, moving from the rhetoric to the actual sort of action. The third, or maybe this should have been the first, was when you talked about the roadmap, the climate action bill, but also essentially the roadmaps and investment plans that countries put together that show direction and set the stage for both public in the form of the multilateral development banks, the regional development banks, as well as the domestic markets, and the private sector to come to the table, because you're showing where you want to go and you're putting in place the ecosystem conditions around it. So for the New York Stock Exchange to trust you, that didn't happen overnight, right? They needed to see something from you that allowed them to believe, hey, we're going to back this. And I think the last point is around the Amazon. And I think the Amazon is one piece, but as we were saying in the green room, this is also the Congo Basin. There's other parts of the world. And how do we remove that disaggregation or that disconnect between nature and development? We also talked about this, right? There are countries across the African continent in particular, but not limited to, especially in small island states that may not have green carbon, but they have blue carbon, right? That need to develop in ways that are sustainable. They need to increase their growth rates. They need to create job opportunities for young people. And it's very, very difficult to do that when you're fighting the kind of nature versus people discussion domestically. Do we cut down our forests? Because someone was mentioning that in Suriname, John, earlier on, we're cutting down pristine forests in Suriname to grow corn and soya, right? Why? Because that creates jobs, and it's a struggle. So the reason I bring this up is that in the context of Barbados, we've just finished an investment plan for the country. I talked about this earlier today, which is looking at about $15 billion over 10 years to invest in a range of resilience-related matters, from social sustainability to economic diversification, because that's critical, right? You can't be reliant on 1 or 2 small sources of revenue from a government perspective, to environmental protection and climate resilience. In order to do that, you need to invest. Barbados is an example, but this is the case for many small island states, including Dominica, which is where I come from. The debt to GDP is in excess of 120% right now. And under the international financial architecture at the moment, they will tell you that's too much. It's not sustainable debt, so you need to bring it down. And the magic number is 60%. You can have 60% of your debt equivalent to GDP. And once you're way above that, the IMF and other members of the international community will say, actually, we need to reduce your borrowing. How do you deal, from your perspective, with this push to reduce borrowing when actually you need to think very carefully about what you're financing and invest more? Be interesting to hear both your perspectives on that, right? So debt swaps are part of it. You can make some of your debt cheaper by, as you said, refinancing this as you would do with a home loan or a mortgage. But ultimately, you're going to need to increase your debt volume. How do you do that?
It is the question facing so many finance ministers and leaders of governments around the world, right? They have to have the money to develop the infrastructure they need, not only now for their GDPs to thrive and their people to thrive, most importantly, but also to prepare for what's coming, especially the small island development states. What's happening through Bridgetown as well as other initiatives, and I will just give some credit to an institution I often don't give a lot of credit to, and that's the World Bank. I know that's your employer, but sometimes the World Bank is big and bureaucratic and is not really thinking about a lot of the needs of these local countries. I will say there is a movement with new leadership there under Ajay Banga to really take a new look at how the World Bank and other multilateral institutions are lending. Looking at things like how do we have pauses in debt repayments when there's another pandemic, God forbid? When do we allow countries like Barbados or Belize or any of the countries that have lots of people on coasts to, when a big storm comes, to pause in payments so that they can address the emergency needs of their people now as opposed to paying creditors? So I think the change that's happening in the debt landscape is a really important change. But when I was just in Kenya 2 weeks ago talking to the president and all the finance ministers there and people involved in this stuff, and they just said, we have to have more money. We need more debt. But can we have debt on the terms that's better for us? And I will say that there's three, Kenya, Zambia, and I think Nigeria, those three presidents are coming together for a new plan for African lending that puts Africans more in the driver's seat. Because historically, all these countries are basically just saying, we'll take whatever terms you can give us. And they're saying, no more. We cannot do that. We have to be proactively pushing our terms. And I think some of the multilateral institutions are actually listening to that and are trying to change their ways. But we as an international community need to be pushing them to do that as well.
So I have the conception that debt is a great obstacle for climate action today. And maybe people are not familiar with the idea that on average, the rate of debt to GDP is above 95%, which means you have very limited fiscal space in the countries to say, okay, I want to do this bold investment on climate action. So it becomes a vicious circle. So you don't have the fiscal space, you don't have the resources, you don't do the investments, and we're full of commitments towards 2030 and 2050. So the question is, how can we release in an intelligent way available resources? And I will mention at least four ideas. One, as Jennifer said, there has to be an agreement first of saying that climate action is an investment, not an expenditure. It's an investment. So the International Monetary Fund, that is the one that defines which are the best practices in terms of fiscal availability, can make a statement and say, for countries that have to make these investments quite fast, great part of those investments cannot be counted as if they were expenses in terms of the budget. So if they are allowing some of the developed countries, Global South, to have special purpose vehicles for those investments and are not counted on the fiscal deficit margin calculations, that can release resources. And then you'll say, why this is so important? Because, as Pep was saying, that level of indebtedness with the limited fiscal space makes the environmental minister a pain in the neck for the rest of the ministers in a cabinet, because everybody is chasing a penny. And this will guarantee that you have those resources allocated for that purpose. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is debt swaps, which is very important, because you can say to a country, okay, you protect, you enhance those investments for climate action, and we can write off some of the debt. Fine. But even if it's a write-off, you still have to condition some of those swaps to effective investments, because otherwise what we'll just is taking numbers away from a balance sheet, but you will not be effectively deploying the capital where the capital needs to go. And the third thing is guarantees, because as Kenichi Omaya used to say, we have to think globally, but we have to act locally. And many of the climate action responsibilities are connected with local governments. And those local governments are saying, okay, we want to invest, but they don't have long-term financing. And if they want to ask for the World Bank or any other multilateral to get resources, they'll have to request to the national government a guarantee that is, in accounting practices, considered as a loan of the national government, so it maintains the vicious circle of not allowing the capital to flow. So in that case, I think from environmental philanthropy, from multilateral agencies and bilateral donors, guarantee funds for local governments to allow them to raise resources long-term at a very affordable price has to be put together. And last but not least, the carbon credits or biodiversity credits that are another discussion that is taking place. But of course, there are people that have criticized negative experience on the carbon credits. Of course. But it's a voluntary carbon market that has been improving over time. But it's the only way that we can massively mobilize liquidity for climate action purposes, especially in the global south. And we need that in developed countries, when some of the projects that are going to be presented can come from initiatives in the global south. And we can improve the integrity, improve the practices, but carbon credits are today the most effective mechanism to massively deploy the liquidity available for ESG in the global south. So with those four elements, I think we can definitely move the needle. Without the combination of those four, it's going to be very difficult, and we might end up with very good pledges, but not effective disbursements and achievements.
Fully agreed. I see Jennifer's about to grab the mic.
Yeah, I want to pick up on your last point, because I think, I'm just going to be, it's a small group. I'm going to be really honest. We have been horrible at telling the story about carbon credits. Our entire sector has just been crap at this. We use a lot of technical terms, monetization, la, la, la. But I want to tell you a story of an experience I just had where it really was an aha moment for me. I've known, of course, money's going to communities, but I was in Kenya. I was in the northern part of Kenya, which is one of the poorest parts of Kenya, a couple weeks ago, and I was very fortunate to be able to do an overflight of communities. This place, through a partner of ours, is doing one of the world's largest savanna-based carbon projects. And we flew over, and the guy that was talking to me, the pilot, said, "Jen, look down. That is the school that carbon built. Look over there. That hospital, carbon built that. That teacher's housing, carbon." Never before had this community seen the amount of resources that came into their place before carbon credits. We need to tell those stories. We need to tell the stories from the communities, because that's often what's lost in the whole debate about, are we greenwashing and all that, which the integrity standards are getting much, much better. We've made mistakes. We've learned from them. But it is essential money for communities to protect nature and to actually invest in their communities that they haven't had before. So I would encourage everyone in this room to learn about those stories, to tell those stories, and don't get lost in the, sort of these debates which aren't really meaningful at a local level. Right. I know there's people wanting to get in.
I can see people wanting to put their hands up. I don't know that we've set this up for questions, but maybe we can jump in on that in a second. Can I just finish off on this kind of topic? So firstly, you mentioned the recent article by President Ruto I think it's President of Ghana and Zambia, right, in The Economist. If you haven't looked it up, or if you haven't read it, look it up. It's a really interesting article. And I think that so firstly, they tell a very compelling story around debt, and having the terms change is critical, right? And one of the reasons the terms are the way they are is that countries are considered high risk. And if you're high risk, you just pay more, right? And we need to kind of get out of that, because if you are vulnerable, climate vulnerable, and otherwise vulnerable because you're trying to meet your sustainable development goals, and you're paying more money to reduce all of these challenges, it's just slightly perverse. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing relates to carbon markets and really looking at what the assets are. So for small island states or large ocean states, your assets are the marine environment. For countries in Central Africa, it could be your forests, right? Similar to the Amazon. So I think we really need to look at the asset base. Before I kind of go into my next point, can I just have a raise of hands? How many people are generally climate adjacent, climate expert types? So few, okay. How many people are familiar with the International Development and Finance Architecture and the Bridgetown Initiative? Oh, 2, excellent. Right, or 3, 4, excellent. We were all in the same session. So very few people, and I think we're throwing out language that may not make sense, but look up the Bridgetown Initiative. There's a version 3.0 coming out, which is sitting with our reviewers. So the Bridgetown Initiative is aiming to kind of shift how the development finance architecture works, and President Duque, the 4 points that you raised around climate as investment, right, or investing in climate resilience as being weighted differently is one of the points that we have in Bridgetown, so we're fully aligned. I think your second point, so all your points are absolutely relevant, right, around debt swaps, around guarantees, and what did I write here, around biodiversity credits. Let me throw in a couple of additional ones. We're using this language of debt to GDP, right? So hopefully, this is not a science lesson, but hopefully you understand that, right? If your economy is growing really fast and you have a certain amount of debt, your debt to GDP ratio is pretty low, which is great. So you have 2 ways of dealing with that. One is you weight your debt differently. The other is you grow your economies. And this is one of the pieces I think that's often missing. We talk about development finance, but we're not talking about trade. We're not talking about how we make economies sustainable and grow sustainably. And that's a critical piece. But you can't do that without investment, which gets you into this vicious cycle. And you can't invest if you can't borrow in affordable terms. So you're essentially keeping countries handcuffed. And that's a cycle that we need to break. That's one point. I think the second point is around private participation. We keep assuming the governments need to borrow, and they do. But they need to borrow because the private sector either cannot deal with the investments, they can't develop them fast enough, or they cannot borrow cheap enough. And if they can't borrow cheaply enough, then the government has to do it. So there's a multifaceted set of cement blocks that our feet are stuck in that effectively we need to loosen ourselves from. And this is where things like guarantees can come in. So maybe a question for you. What do you think it will really take to take the obvious ideas that you're describing, the amazing real-world examples that when you fly over, it's impossible to ignore. What do you think it will take to get those to scale and to get the decision makers within the global architecture to change their views? What is the fundamental bottleneck? Because every entity has a board. Right, and this is where I'm going to be fairly politically incorrect. And those boards set a lot of the rules, right? It's the governance around the system. What are the details that need to change within the machinery in order to unlock all of these very obvious solutions? None of this that we're talking about is new or rocket science, right? We haven't invented anything here. What's missing?
More than what's missing is what do I consider is the element of success when it comes to government and private sector interaction. I believe heads of state need to become chief environmental officers of the country, because if this doesn't flow rapidly top down, things will take too long to materialize. And I remember that when we started pushing all this agenda in Colombia, I decided to create a climate action cabinet with the climate action bill, and I actually put the presidential chief of staff to control and coordinate the climate action cabinet. So we got all the sectors that had to work to move the needle. So transportation, agriculture, infrastructure, housing, you name it, all the sectors had specific targets. And I think that helped a lot. But there's one element in which I consider we have to focus in a very fast way, and I go back to the Amazon. The Amazon is as big as the United States. The whole biome is more than 7 million square kilometers. The Amazon absorbs 10% of all the greenhouse gases emissions every year. And we have lost to deforestation the equivalent of Texas and California in the last 40 years. And if that rate of deforestation continues, the Amazon in less than a decade is going to be a net emitter of greenhouse gases and no longer a contention wall. So we need to bring that deforestation to zero. How? So in that how is where the private sector needs to help. I'm just going to mention 3 ideas on sectors. 1, yellow machinery. I was president visiting all these places, and in the middle of nowhere, I found a 50-ton yellow machinery working for illegal mining. And you don't get those machines installed with a local mechanic. You need to have a very strong and powerful coordination to get that happening. We need to call all the yellow machinery companies globally to identify and geolocalize all the yellow machinery in hot environmental spots, and try to use technology with AI elements to make those yellow machineries unworkable if they are located in hot spots. We also need, and that's also very important from the private sector, to have aggregated value chains with Amazonic products. So what deforates the Amazon? Illegal cattle, illegal wood, illegal crops, and illegal mining. But what happens if we, for example, work with indigenous communities on Sachainchi, Copoazu, Camu Camu, products from the Amazon that with an aggregated value can be sold in big markets and can generate a sustainable income with indigenous communities? That's also a change. And the third element, AI technologies and satellite technologies can allow us to monitor today with more precision the amount of carbon that is captured per unit of geography. And that can help to trigger the market, but it can also help us create a unit of value for biodiversity and create effective biodiversity credits. So those top-down, if you combine the policies with this empowerment of the private sector, I think we can definitely move the needle in the next 7 years according to the plans that we have globally.
Yes, I would agree. I just want to also just celebrate the leadership that President Duque has not only had when he was in power, but now globally. He's really, I mean, the example of Colombia, that leadership, I mean, one thing that Colombia has done, and other countries have done too, but our lovely country here in the US has not done, is put a price on carbon, is actually to create a market for carbon. So I think that is one, thank you. Yes, we need this, believe me, I keep preaching this, preaching. But, you know, political winds, as they are, have shifted in a different direction. That being said, I think seeing those examples, I mean, China's doing this as well. I mean, we often don't, talk about China in a very proactive and positive way, but they have done this, and they're seeing good results as well. So, I think we need that leadership, but then we also need to bioeconomy, what you mentioned, bioeconomy, this is a big topic in Brazil right now, and in the Amazon, is creating, economic opportunities that preserve nature for indigenous people. That's really critical. But what we also need to do is stop the destruction that's happening now, in particular from the cattle industry. Let's just talk about it. Because the cattle industry, in particular in Brazil, and we work very closely in the state of Pará, which has 24 million head of cattle. They're not being traced like we trace cattle in other parts of the world. There's very few ear tags. They're not required to do that, but now you have a change in leadership, both at the state level. You have a governor that said, I want 100% deforestation-free cattle from my state by 2025. And then he turns around to his ministers and says, how are we going to do that? And we're working directly. I mean, I'm the CEO of an environmental organization, and I'm working with the cattle industry because why? We have to. If you just shout at them and say, stop, 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 nothing's going to change. And that's what's happened for decades. Nothing has changed. We do have new leadership at the state level. We, of course, have Lula, who's really pushing this. But we have to find solutions. So what we're doing now, using satellite technology, using ear tags, is piloting this. We're taking advantage of that leadership and actually showing how this can work. And we had, this made it seem very technical and not a big deal, but it's a huge deal. We had 2 days last month where 100% of the cattle had ear tags that went to market. 100%. That has never happened in Brazil. But now we need to go faster so we can stop that Amazonian destruction. And I just want to say, to Iván's point, the urgency in the Amazon cannot be overstated. So we are at 17%, 17 to 18% now of clearing of the original extent of the Amazon. Johann Rockstrom and other preeminent scientists say if we get to 21%, that forest starts to turn into a savanna and it becomes a net emitter. And people on the ground there are saying that they're seeing fires in tropical forest environments that they have never seen in their lifetimes or in their grandparents' lifetimes. So this is a very new day. The urgency is now. So we need bioeconomy. We need all of these things that we were talking about. But we also have got to change the cattle sector. So that would be my plea to really push that.
No, I think these are incredibly tangible points, and to be very honest with you, you've said some stuff, some things, President Duque in particular, that I wouldn't have thought about, right? I mean, locking down machines would be amazing. So I think that there's ideas, if you're passionate about this space, to kind of take some inspiration. I'd love to, turn this to the audience in a second in terms of kind of what people feel they could be doing, but I saw some questions. Are you okay with us taking those? Oh, right. Wow.
Yep.
Let's just go left to right, or... No, you're stuck in there. Oh, okay. Well, second row. Oh, no, sorry. All the way. You had a question. Was it a few minutes ago? There's one behind. Or a point? Oh, wow. In the back of the hat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. Sorry. We'll start at the back, yeah.
Question for you. So, thanks for everything you're talking about regarding markets and the way money can move us towards. How does law work in this? Because obviously you can really frame and move and incentivize people and disincentivize people from to do the right thing and to not to do the wrong thing by giving, not just forcing them through the law of like human values, but actually giving standing to nature and to biodiversity in the law. And if you can bring a tree or a forest or an animal or a species into having standing and having voice in the way we think about what is right and what is the right action to take, you can change the way people think. A lot of the way we speak about it is very anthropomorphic, right? It's extremely anthropomorphic, and markets are going to do this, and it's all about us, and nature can help us, and all these things. But actually, there's a lot of reason for nature to stand on its own, for its own reason. We're the adolescents in the room. There's a lot of things that are much more advanced than us.
Great question. So how do we give nature rights? Are we giving them rights?
No, I'm
just
going to give you an example about law and order regarding nature. And when we started tackling deforestation in Colombia with multiple instruments, and still we haven't been able to solve it fully because it has to be a long-term state policy, we found out that most of the environmental crimes didn't have any imprisonment sentence. So they were full of impunity. So you can literally destroy hectares in the Amazon, and you'll just get a little pinch because you will have to pay a small fine. And it happens that those crimes that are crimes against nature are also crimes against humanity. So we made some reforms in the legislation so that crimes against nature will have clear imprisonment sentences and will have a clear statement. So that's the stick. Now, if you combine the stick with the carrot and you start empowering local communities to conserve and preserve and get paid out of effectively doing it and monitoring with clear KPIs, we were able to create, as a pilot program, 10,000 families that were national conservation contracts based. So we paid them to protect the forest. So you can use the market element, and you can use also the law and order element. And last but not least, and I think you said something very important, nature has rights, and rivers have rights, and ecosystems have rights. And it takes a lot of courage by legislators and governments to say that clearly. But I'm happy to see that more or less in a great vast of the Amazonic countries, at least legally, we have made a big step. What we need is to do more to effectively protect with the law and order mechanisms. So I think that will be the approach, and I absolutely agree with you that if we move along those lines and there's a clear commitment top-down in government, we will do much better. But I'll just give you those two examples of things that need to be done.
Thank you. Those are great points. We're going to go through quite quickly, just so we catch everyone. Please jump in.
So we've talked about the idea of essentially making conservation valuable, giving a dollar amount that's more powerful. I think the quote was given in the earlier session today about making it more powerful, more valuable to save a tree than to cut it down. And one mechanism that has been in place for a long time is ecotourism in doing this. And I'm wondering, compared to some of the other vehicles that you're talking about today, where do you see ecotourism fitting into the whole grand scheme of things?
Yeah, very, very important. Great question. Ecotourism is essential, and we see, as long as it's our approach to ecotourism is we want local people to be able to own those lodges and have the best benefit. That's the sort of classic high level ecotourism, high quality ecotourism. Essential. It's absolutely essential. Unfortunately, not all countries that need to develop their bioeconomies have opportunities for great tourism. A lot do. Of course, the Amazon countries do. A lot of African countries do. So you have to be able to, Caribbean countries do. You guys are going to see some of that. But not all of them don't. But where it is viable, absolutely. But let's make sure that locals are really, really benefiting, and that whether it's a scheme for local ownership or ensuring that all the employees are local, or there's at least a glide path for local ownership is the way I would approach it. But it's really important.
Can I add
please.
something to that? Something that I didn't ever thought was going to become a powerful argument, for example, with investors, occurred in one of my last meetings in Davos in May 2022. And I was in a meeting with investors, and somebody said, tell me about how green is Colombia in order for us to mobilize more capital. So I thought it was a very interesting question. And I said, well, we have spent a lot of time globally thinking that competitiveness is also associated with cheaper labor cost or lower energy cost. And by that, we ended up incentivizing a lot of environmental destruction in many places. So I said, the good story to tell us an example of Colombia is that we have one of the lowest amounts of emissions per point of GDP compared to some of the 5 biggest economies in Latin America, which means that a dollar invested in Colombia is a greener dollar than invested somewhere else. If we start using just that indicator for things like ecotourism, energy transition, and all variables of green economy sub-industries, I think we will have a stronger argument, and I will encourage a lot of you who are investors and potentially think in different places, try to have that environmental competitiveness indicator. What's the amount of emissions per point of GDP when you're thinking of moving from country A to country B as an element for your analysis?
And I think that's an absolutely critical point. I think the metrics really matter. Right? If you're looking at a return on investment with a dollar figure, all of a sudden you're incentivized to do things very, very differently from a carbon emission reduction metric point of view. I realize that I'm just cheating by jumping in on your point, but can I just say on ecotourism, fully agreed with Jennifer. I come from Dominica, a very green and lush country, but the reality is that the market side cannot be ignored. If tourists go to a country and they're looking for a certain experience, and the country itself, if it's a very small island state or it's a very niche market in Equatorial Guinea, cannot provide exactly that, the developers that come to build hotels in these untouched countries, that come to the new untouched, pristine destination with a Club Med, they're going to source not from the local market, not sustainably. They're going to import container loads of stuff. Why? Because the consumer wants to walk in to this ship and see things that look a certain way and have a breakfast that they're used to. They may not want camu camu for their breakfast. They may want, honeydew melon. And that distorts it. So I was going to say this earlier. I had a Five Guys burger yesterday. I'm not a huge meat eater, but I was stuck at the airport and starving. And I'm not here to shame anyone. But if we're consuming stuff and not demanding either traceability and there's a lot of labeling, right? Let's be very frank, right? Sustainable, green, whatever. But if we're not demanding things, then ultimately we're failing the system. But I do think that law comes in. But fundamentally, it's also about the systems. And one last point on tourism is that we can make tourism sustainable, but what happens when you get wiped out by a Category 5 hurricane like Dominica, right? Overnight, you've lost everything. Right? And it's not even a hugely tourism-dependent economy. I keep saying if Barbados, for which 45% of the GDP directly or indirectly comes from the tourism sector, was hit by a Category 5 hurricane, that's 50% of your economy, not your GDP, your economy, your jobs, your revenues, gone overnight. You can't, so there's also something to be said about you can green and have community participation and backward value chains, but ultimately we need to create sustainable systems that go beyond just that niche, and we're part of the challenge.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk, great stuff. I would love to hear your advice on, I'm in the environmental justice movement, and for the first time I've started intersecting with the housing movement. And they are really at odds. And I didn't have a good answer in a room for, can this housing money be used to conserve land, trees matter too, when there's all this suburban, anyway, I don't want to get into the details of the problem, but I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about a better way to talk about kind of the environmental justice meets the housing movement, because they shouldn't be apart, right?
Great. Would one of you like to take that?
No, great question. So, we work a lot in cities here in the U.S., and it comes up all the time, especially when you're thinking about coastal communities that are on the front lines or seeing sea level rise, or whether it's here in the U.S. or other places, and are the ones that bear the brunt and also can't afford flood insurance. Can't afford it. So there has to be, I think, a holistic approach to that, of looking at the climate models. I mean, some of the stuff that if you guys are really into this and want to be scared at night, this sort of dystopian future of what's happening on our coasts is pretty frightening. But yet we're continuing to build houses. Now, most of those houses are not affordable housing. They're the sort of people who want that beachfront property. But we need to have a holistic approach to affordable housing in places that will be protected, and whether it's through things that we do a lot of, which is the green infrastructure combined with the great infrastructure that can protect those communities, it's essential. And I think some communities are doing a relatively good job of holistically looking at it, but you're absolutely right. Those things come together and really important to think about.
I will add to what Jennifer just said, how important it is to start using AI as a tool to do some more forecasting of potential risks associated with housing and any form of infrastructure. So just to give you an idea, 2021 was one of the years with more hurricanes Category 5 ever. And they obviously have affected the US, but they also affect global south countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And if we don't put those forecasts, we're not going to clearly identify what's going to be the economic cost of that. And it will be, for people, very important to know if the asset that they're buying today is going to be worth what they paid, or is it going to lose a value over time. So I think using those technologies are very important, but also insurance industry is going to change dramatically. So you have places where there are more propenses to have this kind of incidents like hurricanes Category 4 and 5. And what happens is, for example, in the US, many of the cost of insurance in the rest of the country are subsidizing some of the costs of those insurances in Miami, for example. So I think we need to have clear data and to identify that if we don't make changes, we're going to leave more people behind the coverage of insurance for climate action risks. And I think AI can play a very important role there.
We need to talk about insurance in DC.
Yes.
Yes.
We're doing a ton of stuff in insurance.
Super important point. We're putting it into Bridgetown, and it's really not clear to me how the insurance industry is going to survive unless they fundamentally change their models. But we can't ignore them, right? They have to be part of the solution. Sam. Oh, sorry. Did you sneak in? Okay. Can you just raise hands again? Okay. 1, 2, 9 minutes.
So
yes, Sam.
Blending. So Sam Teicher from Coral Vita, market-based solutions for coral restoration. Trying to achieve multiple goals with the same policies and finances. If you stop deforestation, that also, in many cases, cleans rivers, which means the ocean's going to be healthier. If you're focused on conservation, it also could be tied in with regeneration. So I'm just curious to get your guys' perspectives on how you think we can, from a policy and a finance perspective, tie a lot of these goals together that often are put into silos that are disconnected, but so much are not.
I'm going to be out of my comfort zone, 30 seconds each.
Well, of course, coral reefs are the answer. Right, Sam? Look, every dollar is critical, whether it's a donor dollar or a public funding dollar. And so finding those solutions, whether it's, obviously mangroves are critical that do all of those things at the same time. Fish nurseries, they protect shorelines, they're really important for soaking up carbon. So you finding those biomes and those solutions that can achieve multiple things and telling that story in a compelling way.
No, I think your question is brilliant, but I have to tell you my biggest concern. Deforestation and negative use of land, if it were a country, it would be the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And it is the main source of emissions in the global south. And we need to accelerate the deployment of capital to contain deforestation and recover land. And I believe that we need to put a unit of value to nature-positive policies. Carbon, we have already defined that there's a pricing. But if we don't do that with nature, it's going to be very difficult to move the capital where it needs to move. And I look forward to COP16 this year that is taking place in Colombia, but also COP30, to try to define a unit of value that can help us tackle what I consider the most challenging climate action issue in the global south, which is deforestation and negative use of land.
Yes.
Amazing. 1, 2, 3, and that's it. Oh, wow,
Yeah,
sorry,
I've got the mic
I
here.
couldn't see you
Super
down
fast.
there.
Can we turn down the air conditioning on the boat? We're sitting here talking about deforestation and proper use of resources, and it's freezing in here for no reason. We are killing the environment at this moment. We all sort of have to take responsibility as we eat the food on the ship, as we take too much, as we look at everything around us of the impact that we are all having at this very second. Thank you.
Amen. I couldn't agree more.
Can we turn down the air conditioning?
Well, I don't control the air conditioning, but you can put that out there or ask them at the front desk. 1, 2, 3, and then I think we only have 6 minutes, so just 15-second question, and we'll get 30-second responses.
And we can stay
Indigenous
around.
communities are one of the most effective forms of conservation that we have, and I was wondering if there's any particular mechanisms that you've seen be particularly effective or solutions that you're excited about.
There are several, but I will say that they're not big enough yet. So I have a dear friend, Hindu Ibrahim, who often says, Indigenous people oversee and steward 80% of this planet, and yet you guys don't trust us with your money. Why, right? So we have to be able to provide direct money into Indigenous organizations, Indigenous communities to actually manage their own resources. So there's some things happening. Maybe the new global biodiversity framework, which is supposed to be more direct access, will work. I'm a little skeptical of what I'm seeing now, just because of how it's developing. We're pushing to have some sort of way. It's about trust, right? And so how do we build that trust, and how do we build those track records? But I think slowly we're seeing more movement in that direction.
I would suggest, and I think for example, the Nature Conservancy and other organizations have worked with this, and from the government we have also done it, is let's try to expand the participation of indigenous communities in the payment for ecosystemical services. Have the cooperatives, help them to become social entrepreneurs locally, in which they can get resource and payment based on their conservation targets and goals. That, for me, will be much more successful than relying solely on government deployment of capital without any indicator.
Sorry, I fully agree with both of. Sorry, do you want to jump in
I was
again?
just going to say there's some indigenous carbon, to Yvonne's point. There's some indigenous carbon projects that are happening. I'm happy to tell you about more after.
So may I respectfully what you said, I fully agree with. I think these are exactly the ways to go, but I would respectfully disagree. And I think that's because fundamentally we don't have scale. So you've talked about not large enough, but there's a reason that the models and the modalities with which indigenous communities operate and have operated for thousands of years are not mainstream, right? There's a whole history to that. And my sense, without being an environmental justice expert or social justice expert, is that you're fighting a centuries-long extractives model of development, which has been perpetuated by those who are largely, the global north and kind of those who are largely in power right now, and asking indigenous communities to go toe-to-toe with that. I mean, we'll always have amazing examples of what works, but the scale will always be tiny because it's a David and Goliath kind of situation. I don't want to belabor the point, and feel free to disagree if you feel so, but my sense is that it's almost rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, not to bring it too close to home, literally, that, let's adjust this, but the system is not only broken, it is destructive. It is extractive, and, like it's tweaking the cogs in a machine that's gone, awry. My view. And I'm an optimist,
agree.
a hopeless optimist, but I feel that we talk about indigenous communities, and even the language of communities is like, wait, the system is a community in the system.
I think we're being a little reductionist when we talk about indigenous communities. They're so diverse. There's some that have a lot of capacity to take money that still are not able to access, and there's others that are, last mile, don't see anyone or anything, and I think that's not what we're talking about here. There's a lot of different, kind of capacities there.
Of course. Okay, so 2 more questions super quickly. We have 2 minutes.
No, it builds on what Pepukaye was saying, that how do we, as we acknowledge and transform solutions, I still don't believe we've brought in truth and reconciliation, acknowledging systemic racism, Western imperialism. So what truth-seeking efforts can we support to center on Western imperialism and name that front and center? Like, what do reparations look like? How do we continue to hold countries, especially the U.S., accountable?
Yeah, well, I'll just mention I completely 100% agree with you. And while we're not out to necessarily change the whole system, where we have the capacity to do something really important, we're doing it. So, for example, we're giving land back to indigenous people. So land that we have owned for a long time because somebody died and gave it to us. We're like, this is not white people's land. This is your land. And building that capacity for people to actually manage that land. The other thing is buffalo. So I don't know if you guys know anything about buffalo. I didn't know anything about before taking this job. I am the biggest bison buffalo advocate out there now, and we are giving buffalo, which are the cultural center of the Native American communities, back to indigenous people. So we transferred 900 head last year alone of bison that we happen to own back to indigenous communities on their land, and they're managing it. And that just makes me so happy. So that's just one small example. We need to do more of that, and then we need to tell people that this is possible. Do more of this. If you have these resources, give them back. It's not ours, it's theirs. And I think that's a whole cultural shift that we need to do as a community.
Just 10 seconds. I think what works a lot, especially when you deal with indigenous communities in the way you plan a climate action and energy transition and so on, is that we have to defeat that sentiment that there's like an indigenous people's silo. So the indigenous communities is right there, and they only talk about their issues and they only think about their things. No, we have to include, with a leadership role, with empowerment, indigenous communities to help us define policy and market solutions at all scale, in all circumstances, because that's real participation. And I think that helps us to defeat that system of thought where they're always think that's a minority. They have to be participant actively in every strategical decision on the environment, on the economy, you name it.
And in leadership, right? So if you look at the cabinet of the US government, right, or the cabinet of the Brazilian government, where do you have representation? I love your classes, by the way, but just a point in terms of reparations, and it's a long, complex story. We can talk about reparations for slavery, we can talk about reparations for environmental destruction. I just have one word: Haiti. If you haven't read the article in the New York Times from 2021, 2022, on the history of Haiti and what happens when you extract, and fundamentally crush an economy for centuries, I think that's self-explanatory. Red light flashing. I don't think we can. Carrie? Can we take one more question?
I can try
Yes,
to be
thumbs
try to
up,
be quick.
please.
You mentioned some great points on AI and technology forward solutions. I was just curious about, we're in the age of synthetic biology. We can engineer trees to absorb more carbon. We can eradicate malaria and mosquitoes and save avian flu. Like we can do a lot with synthetic biology. Does that have a seat in all of this? Is that integrated into the thinking around putting a price on biodiversity and saving?
Well, this is my first time at the summit, and last night I came with a suit, which is kind of awkward in this amazing environment, and I was sitting in a table with an amazing person that I met last night, Chris, and he was telling me that he's working on a specific protein that can help cattle reduce methane emissions. So that is so practical that's a small example of the things that can happen. And I'm going to mention something that can be controversial, because everybody now is discussing, for example, on banks, how green are bank portfolios and balance sheets. And what happens is that there are many sectors that are difficult to abate, sectors that have a longer transition on carbon neutrality. And the pressure on banks is basically saying, if you want to look nicer, you better take out of your balance sheet all these industries that are so contaminant. Well, if you do that, you're going to not be able to lend long-term a good price to those industries to use those kinds of technologies and explore those kinds of technologies to have a better contribution on climate action. So I do believe what you just mentioned, and specifically technology on biotech, is going to be so important to help specific sectors, including cattle, including also the replacement of wooden materials that is so important and necessary, but also it can help us as humans to reduce our own carbon footprint. Because we always think carbon footprint is somewhere there's government responsibilities, corporate responsibilities. On an individual basis, I think biotechnology can help us a lot to reduce our individual carbon footprint, so I fully agree with you.
I would agree, except let's not forget that nature's been working for millions of years on its own technology, and we can't forget that. Well, we need to do that. It's a yes and. I sometimes worry that we look at technology as it's going to be our savior and it will fix all of our problems. If we continue at the rates of deforestation that we're seeing, which right now, last year, the report from Global Forest Watch just came out today, 2023, we had a football pitch, a soccer pitch, 10 of those every single minute last year of tropical deforestation. So if we continue to do that, all the synthetic biology in the world won't save us.
No, and just jumping in on that, fully agree. I think these are all amazing tools to add to the toolkit. But fundamentally, it's a little bit like, we want to install renewable energy all over the place, but no one wants to consume less energy. So there's a boring negawatt solution, which is like, let's just reduce our consumption. Oh, we can't? All right, so let's replace it, with stuff that's less polluting. So I do think it's on both sides. Just a couple of points. Firstly, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for showing up en masse and for being so engaged. I'm now going to be in trouble. I thought we had a pact in our prep call that we were not doing suits. You were going to wear guayabera. I thought you were going to chill. I'm in slippers. My prime minister's, if this is recorded, I'm in trouble. But seriously, and I mean this with all sincerity, this is one of the most interesting, and like your level of depth on topics and examples is amazing. One of the most interesting and passionate conversations I've had for a very long time. So thank you so much. Please join me.
Thank you all. Thank you, Pep.